The old woman's hands were trembling, not from cold, though the February air coming through the cracked window of the care facility's common room was sharp enough to sting. She was trembling because of what she was holding. A photograph, faded at its edges, the glossy surface gone soft with age and handling. She was holding it out toward the man standing in the doorway, and her eyes had gone glassy with something he could not immediately name. He was a stranger to her. He had walked in 3 minutes ago, a German shepherd pressed against his left leg, looking for a woman named Dolores Marsh, who owed his family nothing, and yet had asked for him by name. He had come because a county social worker had called, and because his commanding officer had told him to take the leave he had been ignoring for 11 months, and because some part of him that still ran on instinct had recognized the address when he heard it. Harlan County, Claymore, Tennessee, a town he had not entered in 14 years. The dog pressed his nose briefly against the back of the man's hand. Then Farley lifted his head and looked at the woman, and the low sound in his chest was not a growl. It was something quieter and more certain. The Marine stepped forward and took the photograph from Dolores Marsh's trembling fingers, and the world, as he understood it, shifted beneath him. If this story is reaching something you did not expect, stay with it. Subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and watch until the very end. The best part is still ahead. Gunnery Sergeant Cole Danner was 39 years old, broad through the shoulder and lean through everything else, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, and a set of dark eyes that rarely blinked more than necessary. His hair was cut close at the sides and left short on top, black with the first real threads of gray working in at his temples. There was a scar along his left forearm, thin and pale, from a piece of rebar in a collapsed building in eastern Afghanistan. And there was a different kind of mark that did not show, which was what 14 years of searching for reasons not to come home looked like when it finally settled into a man's posture. He moved the way people moved who had learned to expect the ground to change without warning. He moved with purpose and with space on all sides of him. And he always, without thinking about it, stood with his back to the wall when walls were available. His dog, Farley, was a German shepherd, 7 years old, amber and black in equal measure, with ears that stood straight and alert, and a chest built like a barrel. Farley had been Cole's partner for 4 years, adopted out of a military working dog retirement program, when the dog's original handler had been medically separated. They had taken 3 weeks to decide they trusted each other. After that, the trust had not wavered once. Cole had driven the 8 hours from Fort Campbell, with the seat pushed back and Farley taking up most of the passenger floor, the dog's chin resting on the console between them for the first 2 hours, which was as close to conversation as either of them needed. He had the address written on a folded paper in his jacket pocket. He had very little else by way of plan. The social worker's call had been short and factual. Dolores Marsh, 73 years old, widowed, no surviving children. A resident of Sunridge Senior Care in Claymore for the past 2 years, deteriorating health. She had asked, specifically and repeatedly, for Cole Danner, United States Marine, son of Raymond Danner, formerly of Harlan County. She had left the name and the request with the facility director every week for 4 months until someone had finally tracked down a number. Cole had stood in the parking lot of a gas station outside of Nashville and listened to the social worker read the request back to him, and he had felt something tighten in the center of his chest that he could not account for by logic. His father had died 11 years ago. His father had never, to Cole's knowledge, been to Sunridge Senior Care. His father had in fact died 114 miles away from Claymore in a hospital outside Knoxville, after a cardiac event that had arrived without warning on an otherwise ordinary October afternoon. Cole had been in Ramadi. He had not made it back in time. He had not gone back to Harlan County at all after the funeral. 14 years. The care facility smelled of antiseptic and of industrial coffee and of something else underneath those, which was the smell of people who had lived long lives and were living the last portion of those lives in rooms that were not theirs. Cole had signed in at the front desk, and a young aide had walked him to the common room, and Farley had drawn several long looks from the nursing staff, all of which Cole deflected, with the same two-word explanation he always gave. Service dog. The aide had pointed to a corner of the common room where a woman sat in a padded chair by the window, and Cole had walked toward her, and the woman had looked up before he had crossed half the room's distance, and her face had changed in a way that made Cole slow his pace without quite knowing why. She was small in the way of people who had once been taller and had lost the height to years and weight and the compression of time on the spine. Dolores Marsh had white hair cut short and neat, worn close to her head, and a face that had been lovely once and was now something better than lovely, which was specific and weathered and expressive in ways that only decades of full living could produce. Her eyes were pale blue, still sharp despite the film of tears gathering at their lower lids. She was thin. Her hands, when she reached for him, showed the tendons clearly under the skin, and the knuckles were swollen at their joints. But she reached. She reached before he even introduced himself, before he said his name or explained why he had come, and she said, her voice barely above a whisper, with a certainty that did not ask anything of him, she said, "You look exactly like him." Then she had produced the photograph from somewhere, from a pocket in her cardigan, from a place it had apparently lived for a very long time, based on how the fabric around that pocket had shaped itself to the rectangle of the thing. And she had held it out, trembling, and Cole had taken it. He stood in the cold fluorescent light of the common room of Sunridge Senior Care and looked at a photograph of his father at approximately 30 years old. Raymond Danner at 30 was thinner than Cole remembered him. Longer through the face, but the jaw was the same, and the eyes were the same, and the way he was standing, with one shoulder dropped slightly lower, the way men stand when they are at ease but not fully relaxed, that was the same too. Raymond Danner was standing in front of a house Cole did not recognize, a small green-painted clapboard house with a maple tree in the yard, and he had one hand on the shoulder of a young woman of perhaps 25 who was laughing at something off-camera. Cole did not recognize the woman either. Then he looked more carefully at the green-painted house, and he recognized the maple tree. Cole sat down slowly in the chair across from Dolores Marsh, and Farley pressed against his leg and stayed there. "He saved my life," she whispered again. And this time the words landed differently, because now Cole was looking at the house and thinking about the maple tree, and trying to understand how his father had come to be standing in front of a house in Claymore, Tennessee, 14 years before Cole had ever set foot in this county, and what he had done there, and why he had never spoken a single word about it to his son. The story Dolores Marsh told did not come all at once. It came the way true stories come, from people who have held them a long time, carefully and in pieces, with pauses while she gathered the right words, and with sidelong looks at Farley, who had settled himself against Cole's leg and not moved. She told it across 2 hours, while the light through the window shifted from flat white to the pale amber of a winter afternoon. While an aide brought 2 cups of coffee, neither of them drank more than halfway, while Cole said almost nothing and listened with the full attention he had been trained to give to intelligence briefings, and gave now unreservedly to this woman who had known his father. Raymond Danner had come to Claymore in the spring of 1989. Dolores had been 26 years old and newly married to a man named Darnell Marsh. A good man, she said. A careful man. A man who worked at the county equipment depot and had a laugh that could fill up a room. They had been married 14 months. They were renting the greenhouse with the maple tree. They were expecting their first child. In April of that year, Darnell Marsh had been driving home from a night shift on a road that had flooded without adequate warning following 2 days of heavy rain. The truck had gone off the shoulder and into a creek bed running high with runoff. Darnell Marsh had struck his head against the doorframe on the way in and had gone into the water unconscious. Raymond Danner had been passing on that road on his way back from a job site. He had seen the truck go in. He had gone in after it. He had pulled Darnell Marsh from the window of the submerged cab, treading water in the dark with a man twice his weight, and had dragged him up the bank and kept him breathing until the volunteer ambulance arrived. Darnell Marsh had survived. He had required surgery for the head injury and had spent 11 days in the hospital, and he had recovered fully. They had gone on to have 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. And 29 more years of the life together they had come within minutes of losing on an April night in 1989. Cole stared at the photograph in his hands while she talked. His father had been 24 years old. His father had been working construction jobs across 3 counties to save enough money to marry Cole's mother, who was then 19 and living with her parents in Knoxville. His father had never, in all of Cole's memory, mentioned the name Darnell Marsh or the town of Claymore or a creek flood or a drowning rescue or any of it. Cole thought about what it meant to do something that large and say nothing about it for the rest of your life, and he could not find any way to think about it that did not make his throat feel strange. Dolores had searched for Raymond Danner for years after the rescue. Darnell had wanted to thank him properly, to find him and shake his hand and say the things that needed saying. They had a name and a rough description and a county, and they had spent 2 years trying to locate him through contractor directories and county records and word of mouth, and they had never found him. Raymond Danner had moved to Knoxville and married and eventually settled in a small house outside the city, and whatever trail he had left was not a trail they had known how to follow. Darnell Marsh had died 3 years ago, she said. A stroke in his sleep at 71 in the house they had eventually bought from their landlord, the green house with the maple tree. She had kept the photograph of Raymond Danner all those years, the only photograph they had of him, taken by a neighbor who had been on the scene the morning after the rescue, and had caught Raymond leaning against the Marsh house while Dolores stood beside him, not yet believing, still processing what had nearly happened. She said she had carried that photograph in her wallet for 34 years and had moved it to her cardigan pocket when her eyesight had gotten bad enough that she could not find things in her wallet reliably. She said she had looked at it every day for 34 years. She said she had prayed for Raymond Danner every day for 34 years. She said she had wanted for 34 years to find someone who belonged to him and tell them what he had done. Cole's jaw was tight. Farley shifted and pressed his head briefly against Cole's knee, then went still again. Outside the window, what was left of the afternoon light was fading toward the pale gray of early evening, and the maple tree in the facility's small yard stood bare and patient against the sky. Cole looked at the photograph one more time. He looked at his father's face at 30, at the slight drop of one shoulder, at the eyes that were his own eyes, at the expression that was not quite a smile and not quite seriousness, but was something between them, which was how Raymond Danner had looked most of his life, as if he understood something more than he was currently saying. That answer had stayed in Cole's head longer than he expected. He asked Dolores carefully how she had found him. His name, she said. Darnell had written it down that night on a piece of notepaper. Raymond Danner, printed in careful letters which she had kept. When she had been moved to Sunridge 2 years ago, she had given the note and the photograph and the story to the facility director and said, "Before I die, I need to find this man's family." The director had been methodical and kind, and it had taken 18 months and 3 different county records clerks, and 1 military records inquiry, and the social worker's call. But they had found him. They had found Cole. She had not expected a son. She had hoped, she said, for any living person who had known Raymond Danner and who could hear what she needed to say. She had not expected this, she said, looking at Cole, with the pale blue eyes that had spent 34 years carrying this. She had not expected to look up and see his face come through the door. Cole stayed for dinner. He had not planned to. He had told himself on the drive down that he would come and listen and thank the woman for reaching out and drive back the same evening. He stayed for dinner because by the time the aide came to say the dining room was open, Cole had run out of ways to leave. Farley lay under the table with his chin on Dolores Marsh's foot, which she did not notice for the first several minutes, and which, when she did notice, made her laugh for the first time all afternoon, a real laugh, surprised out of her. And something in the room changed when she laughed. Cole ate the institutional food without tasting it, and asked Dolores about her children, who were scattered to Nashville and Atlanta, and 1 daughter in Portland, and about her grandchildren, and about the greenhouse which had been sold after Darnell passed, and about the maple tree which she said was still there. She hoped. She had not been back to see. He asked her about Darnell Marsh. She told him, in the same careful and honest way she told everything, and Cole listened to the shape of a man's life, as it was carried by the woman who had loved him. A good man, a careful man, a man with a laugh that could fill a room, a man who had nearly drowned in a flooded creek in April of 1989, and had instead lived long enough to raise 3 children and hold 6 grandchildren and die peacefully in the house with the maple tree. Cole thought, though he did not say this aloud, that his father had done something in 1989 that had made all of that possible. He thought about the chain of it. The way 1 night and 1 flooded road and 1 man willing to go into cold, dark water had produced 6 grandchildren who would not otherwise exist. He thought about how his father had never mentioned it. He thought about what it meant to carry something like that alone and never ask for recognition. And he thought about how that was, in its way, the most recognizably Raymond Danner thing he had ever heard about his father. He drove to a motel that night instead of back to Fort Campbell. He told himself it was the drive being too long for this hour. He lay on the motel bed with Farley stretched along the floor beside him and looked at the photograph, which Dolores had pressed into his hands when he left, insisting, saying she had kept it long enough and it belonged with family now. He looked at his father's face for a long time. He was not a man who cried easily or often. He did not cry now, but there was a pressure in his chest that had no name he could give it, which was not grief exactly, though grief was part of it, and was not pride exactly, though that was part of it too. It was something that did not have a common word, which was what it felt like to discover that a man you thought you knew had been quietly larger than you understood. Cole had a half-full bottle of water on the nightstand and nothing else. He thought about his father driving back from a job site at 24, tired from a week of work, passing a road at exactly the right moment, making the decision in whatever number of seconds those decisions take, going into the water. He thought about his father never once in Cole's entire lifetime using that night as evidence of anything. He fell asleep with the photograph on the mattress beside him, and Farley breathing steadily on the floor, and he dreamed nothing he remembered. The next morning he drove back to Sunridge. He had not called ahead. He arrived at 7:40 in the morning, before the breakfast trays were cleared, and the aide at the front desk looked up with the particular expression of someone seeing the same person twice in circumstances that suggested something more than a one-time visit. He signed in again. He went to the common room. Dolores was already there, in the same chair by the window, dressed in a blue cardigan today rather than gray, watching the bare maple tree in the yard. She looked up when he came in the door. She looked at Farley, who was moving at Cole's heel. She did not look surprised. "Good morning," she said, which was all she said for a moment, the kind of quiet that did not need filling. Cole sat across from her and said he had some questions, if she was willing. She was willing. He wanted to know everything she could remember about the rescue. Not the broad version she had given him the day before, but the specific version, the sensory one. Everything she could still call up after 34 years. She gave it to him. She was a precise woman, it turned out. A woman who had kept details the way some people keep documents, in order, accessible, accurate. She remembered the color of the water. She remembered the sound Raymond had made when he pulled Darnell up onto the bank, a sound of pure effort, raw and involuntary. She remembered that Raymond's jacket had been brown canvas, and that it had a torn pocket on the right side, and that he had refused to let anyone look at a cut on his arm until Darnell was breathing reliably. She remembered that he had stayed until the ambulance left, and then had driven away before anyone thought to take his license plate. She remembered that she had asked his name through tears, barely able to speak, and that he had said it simply, Raymond Danner, like it was the least important thing about the night. And then he had gotten in his truck and gone. Cole wrote nothing down. He did not need to. Over the following days, he came back 3 more times. He was not sure why. The first time he came back, except that Dolores Marsh was alone, and she had carried his father's name for 34 years, and he was not ready to leave that behind. By the third time, he understood it differently. He was not only there for the story of his father, he was there because something about Dolores Marsh pulled at his attention in the way that long experience had trained him to pay attention to. She was thinner than she should have been for a facility that served 3 meals a day. She moved with a care that was not only age, but pain. She mentioned casually, in the way people mention things they have accepted without examining, that her youngest daughter was handling her accounts, had been handling them for the past 18 months, since Dolores had decided the paperwork of aging was more than she wanted to manage alone. She mentioned that the daughter, Renata, had power of attorney. She mentioned more casually still that her medications had changed twice in the past year, that her prescription costs had gone up considerably, and that her monthly account statement showed charges she did not always recognize, but that Renata handled all of that, and surely had good reasons. Farley had been watching her since the first day. The way the dog watched her had nothing threatening in it. It was the specific quality of attention Farley gave to people he had decided were trustworthy, a sustained, unhurried focus that registered their presence as something worth registering. Cole had learned to trust that more than most human judgments. He did not jump to conclusions. He was not a man who moved before he had something solid to stand on. But he began to pay attention in the manner he had been trained to, which was systematic and patient, and without announcing itself. On his 4th visit, he spoke with the facility director, a woman named Sandra Tifton, 62, practical and direct, who had been the one to track him down. He asked, careful with his phrasing, whether there were any administrative concerns regarding Dolores Marsh's care or accounts. Sandra Tifton was quiet for a moment that went a beat longer than a simple no would have required. Then she said she was not in a position to share financial details about residents, but she said it in a way that held something back, something that a person trained in the language of what was not being said would notice. Cole nodded and thanked her, and went back to the common room. He sat with Dolores and asked her to tell him about Renata, and he listened with the full attention he gave to everything. And when she was done, he stayed another hour, and they talked about the greenhouse and the maple tree and what spring had looked like in Harlan County 30 years ago. When he left that evening, he drove to the county library before it closed and used one of the public computers to look up the name Renata Marsh. Then he drove to the motel and sat on the bed with Farley watching him from the floor and thought for a long time. Cole Danner had grown up watching his father work without complaint and give without accounting and trust that goodness, done quietly and without an audience, was its own complete thing. He had not, in 14 years of soldiering and deployments and every form of institutional and personal hardship the military and the world could produce, found a way to fully locate that quality inside himself. He thought he had understood it as a concept. He was beginning to understand that there was a gap between understanding a thing as a concept and living it in the specific. He called his friend Nora Beckett, who was a paralegal in Nashville, and who owed him nothing but had owed him something once and had said so at the time. He explained what he was looking at in broad terms. She listened without interrupting, which was one of her better qualities. She said there was a particular kind of financial exploitation of elderly adults with assigned power of attorney that was not always immediately visible without the right eyes looking at the right documents. She said she knew someone at the State Adult Protective Services office. She said she could make a call if Cole could get copies of the relevant account statements. She said it carefully, the way lawyers spoke carefully, but she said it. Cole thanked her and put the phone down. He sat with the photograph in his hand, his father at 30 with the slight shoulder drop and the eyes that were his eyes, standing in front of the greenhouse with the maple tree. He thought about 24 years old and a flooded creek in the dark, and a decision made in a matter of seconds. He thought about the chain of it. He went back the next morning. He brought coffee from a drive-thru, 2 cups, because he had noticed that the facility coffee sat in the carafe too long and went bitter. He set 1 cup in front of Dolores and kept the other and sat down, and Farley went directly to the side of Dolores's chair and leaned against it, which was a thing he had now done every visit, which Dolores had begun to reach down for without thinking, her hand finding the top of Farley's head with the ease of habit. He said to her, without preamble but not without gentleness, that he wanted to ask her something and he wanted her to be honest with him, and she said, with the dry wit of a woman who had been honest her entire life and found it generally preferable, that she had not been anything other than honest with him so far and saw no reason to change course. He asked her when she had last held the paper copies of her account statements and read them herself, line by line. She was quiet for a moment. Her hand moved in Farley's fur. She said it had been, she thought, about 18 months. Cole nodded and said he would like to help her look at them, if she was willing. She was quiet again, longer this time. She looked out the window at the bare maple tree. Then she looked at Cole with the pale blue eyes that had been looking at his father's face in a photograph every day for 34 years, and she said it very quietly. She said your father never stopped to think whether it was his problem. He just went in. Cole's jaw moved. He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked back at her and said, "I know." What followed was not fast, and it was not dramatic, and it looked, in its early stages, like almost nothing, which was how the resolution of genuine institutional harm usually looked before it resolved. Cole reached Nora Beckett again and gave her what he had gathered, which was not much, but was specific, which was the pattern Nora had described and had recognized. Nora filed a formal inquiry through the state Adult Protective Services contact she had mentioned. That office assigned a case coordinator named Henry Webb, a careful man in his early 40s with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who had seen this pattern before and knew exactly which threads to pull. Webb contacted the facility director, Sandra Tifton, who had, it became clear, already flagged the account activity in an internal note 3 months prior and had been waiting with the particular patience of a woman who ran a care facility and understood the limits of her authority for someone with standing to bring a formal complaint. The account statements, when examined by Webb's office with access Cole could not have obtained on his own, showed 18 months of irregular withdrawals. Not large ones at first, small ones, the kind that could be attributed to incidental expenses if examined individually and out of context. Then larger ones. Then, in the past 4 months, transfers to an account in Renata Marsh's name at a different bank in Atlanta that totaled $23,000 above any documented care expense. Renata Marsh was 43 years old, lived in Atlanta, worked in pharmaceutical sales, and had visited her mother 4 times in the past 2 years. She had not been present for any of those visits when Cole was there. He did not meet her. He did not want to meet her. That was not his role in this, and he understood his role with the same clarity his father had apparently understood his, which was to do the specific thing that was his to do and not reach beyond it. He gave Webb what he had found on the public record search. He answered Webb's questions directly and completely, and did not editorialize. He stayed out of the rest of it. The facility was cooperative. The bank was cooperative once served with the appropriate documentation. Renata Marsh hired a lawyer. That process was ongoing, Webb told Cole, when Cole checked in 3 weeks later, and it was proceeding, and Dolores Marsh's accounts had been secured, and the power of attorney suspended pending investigation, and a new financial advocate from the county had been assigned. Webb said it carefully, which was that the outcome would be what it would be in the legal process, but that the immediate financial harm had been stopped and would not resume. Cole stood in the parking lot of the care facility in the late February cold, Farley beside him, and nodded at the phone, and thanked Webb, and ended the call. He stood there for a moment longer, his breath visible in the air, the sky the pale, flat gray that had been the sky for most of the 2.5 weeks he had spent coming back to this parking lot. He had asked for a 2-week extension on his leave. He was due back at Fort Campbell in 3 days. He went inside. He had developed, by this point, something close to a routine. He knew which aides started early on weekdays and left coffee in the hallway, carafe longer than it needed to sit. He knew that Dolores ate more when the food was warm and ate less when she was tired. He knew that she slept badly on the nights when the corridor was too loud, which happened when the facility was short a night nurse, which happened more than it should. He knew that she had a daughter in Portland, Celia, who called every Sunday, and that those calls were the brightest thing in her week. He had spoken to Celia twice by phone by this point because Dolores had asked him to, had pressed the phone into his hand on a Sunday afternoon and said, "Tell her," which he had done, plainly and without dramatics, explaining who he was and why he was there and what had been found and what was being done. Celia Marsh Okafor was 50 years old, A landscape architect, competent and warm and furious about her sister, in the way of people who had not wanted to believe what they were now required to believe. She was flying in at the end of the week. She had already spoken to Henry Webb and to the facility director and to the county financial advocate. She had thanked Cole in a voice that had not been quite steady. He had said it was the least he could do and had meant it completely. On his last full day before returning to Fort Campbell, he sat with Dolores in the late afternoon, the light through the window going soft and amber in a way that was unusual for February. A preview of something, the quality of light that arrived before the season changed its mind about winter. Farley was at Dolores's foot. She was stroking the dog's ear without looking at it, her eyes on Cole, with the expression she sometimes had when she was deciding something. She said, "I thought about what to do with that photograph for 34 years. I thought about whether I would ever find the right person to give it to. I was afraid I would die, and nobody would know what your father did." Cole was quiet. She said, "And I was afraid I would die, and nobody would know that a young man went into a dark, flooded creek to save someone he did not know, and did not ask for anything in return, and that it meant everything, not just to Darnell and me, but to 3 children and 6 grandchildren, who would not be here without that," she said, and she looked at him steadily. "I wanted someone who loved him to know how large he was." Cole looked at the window for a moment. The amber light caught the glass and held. Farley made no sound. Cole said, "I already knew he was large. I just did not know all the ways." She nodded once, slowly. Then she said, "You went in too." He looked at her. She said, "You came down here, and you did not know what you were coming for. And you listened, and you stayed, and you looked until you found what needed finding, just like him." That hit Cole harder than he expected. He looked at the floor and breathed through it and looked back up. And the expression on his face was the expression in the photograph, the one that was not quite a smile and not quite seriousness, and she saw it, and she put her hand on his forearm, the way someone touches a hand when they want to say something they have run out of words for. He drove back to Fort Campbell on a Tuesday morning, Farley on the passenger floor again, the photograph in the inside pocket of his jacket, where his hand could feel the shape of it through the fabric. He was not given to sentiment and was not given to keeping things, and he had kept this. He drove with the windows up against the cold and thought about his father. Not about the loss of him, which he had thought about for 11 years, but about the fact of him, the actual dimensions of him, which had turned out to be larger than the 11 years of absence had allowed Cole to hold in his mind. He thought about a 24-year-old man on a rural road making a decision in seconds and carrying the weight of that decision quietly, without acknowledgement or record, for the rest of his life. He thought about what it meant to do that. He thought about what it meant to be the son of a man who had done that, and to spend 14 years treating distance as safety. 3 weeks after his return to Fort Campbell, Cole put in a formal request for a duty station closer to home, not a request he had ever made before. His commanding officer had looked at the request and then looked at Cole for a moment before signing it. A month after the reassignment came through, Cole drove to Knoxville and spent a week. He visited the grave, which he had visited 3 times in 11 years, and which he visited now with Farley at his side, standing in the late March cold with the ground beginning to soften underfoot. Saying nothing for a long time, he visited his mother, who was 67 and in good health, and who had been told Cole was coming, and had made a pot roast because that was the kind of woman she was, which was the kind of woman his father had spent his life alongside. which was a thing Cole now understood in a way he had not quite understood before. His mother asked, over the pot roast, about the woman in Claymore. Cole had called and told her, on the phone, the broad version, because she had deserved to know. He told her the fuller version now slowly, over dinner, with Farley sleeping under the table. His mother listened with her hands folded in front of her on the table, the way she listened to things that required her full steadiness. And when Cole finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I always knew there was something like that in him, something he did not talk about." Cole said he wished he had known. His mother looked at him with the patience of someone who had thought about this for 11 years already. She said, "Honey, knowing it now counts." In April, Cole drove to Claymore on a Saturday and visited Dolores, as he had every 3 weeks since February. Celia Marsh Okafor was there, having come from Portland for the week, and Cole met her properly this time in person, a tall woman with her mother's pale eyes and a direct way of speaking that he respected immediately. She had moved her mother's accounts into a structure that the county financial advocate had helped design. The legal process concerning Renata was proceeding at its own pace, with its own weight. That was not Cole's portion of the story anymore. His portion was simpler. He came, he sat, he brought coffee, he asked questions and listened to the answers. He told Dolores, across several visits, things about his father he had not told anyone else, memories from childhood, the way Raymond Danner built things with his hands and fixed things with patience rather than force, and spoke to people without the performance that other men sometimes put on. He told her about the October afternoon 11 years ago and what it had been like to get that call from 6,000 miles away. She listened to all of it with the same complete attention she had given the story of the rescue, which was the attention of a woman who understood that receiving a thing fully was its own form of honoring it. By May, the maple tree in the facility's yard was in full leaf, green and generous, the kind of green that makes everything look like the beginning of something. Cole sat with Dolores on a Sunday afternoon. Farley stretched out between their chairs in a patch of sunlight that fell across the common room floor. The afternoon was warm and quiet. Celia was due the following weekend. Dolores's monthly account statement had come in the morning and shown nothing unexpected, and she had read it herself, which was something she had started doing again, and which she said she found she did not mind, now that it said what it should say. The investigation into Renata was moving forward. That part would end the way institutional processes ended, without drama, with a formal finding and a consequence that fit inside a legal framework, which was the right shape for that kind of wrong. Cole was not required to watch it. He was required only to have done his part, which he had. He looked at Farley sleeping in the sunlight. He looked at Dolores with her pale blue eyes and her white hair and her hand resting on the arm of the chair in the warm afternoon. He thought about his father going into the water. He thought about what the chain of it had produced, not only the Marsh children and grandchildren, but this specific afternoon, this room, this woman, this particular shape of understanding he had reached across 34 years, and a photograph and an 8-hour drive and an instinct he had followed because he had not known what else to do with it. He reached into his jacket pocket and touched the photograph. Then he left it there. He did not need to look at it anymore. He knew what his father's face looked like. He was beginning to know more clearly what his own looked like. There is a photograph in the world that shows a young man standing in front of a small green house with a maple tree, not smiling quite, and not serious quite, having recently done a thing that he would not speak of for the rest of his life, because it seemed to him the ordinary obligation of any person who happened to be present when someone else needed help. The world is full of those people, and they do not always get found. They do not always have sons who come back to a county they left too young and sit with the woman who kept the photograph and hear the story at last. But sometimes they do. Sometimes the chain holds across the decades and the distance and the silence and delivers to a man sitting in a care facility, common room with a German shepherd breathing at his feet and an old woman's hands trembling across a table, exactly the thing he did not know he had been missing. "Your father was a good man," Dolores had said, on the very first day. Cole had known that. He had just not known the full width of it. Now he did. And it turns out that knowing a thing more fully, even when the person it belongs to is gone, is not a small inheritance. It is the kind that holds. If someone you love has carried something quietly their entire life, something that cost them and that they never asked to be thanked for, may you find out while there is still time to tell them what it means. And if you have been the one carrying something quietly, may someone in your life sit across from you and listen the way Dolores Marsh listened, with the patience of a person who has held a story long enough to know it deserves to be received fully. May the places you have been too long away from still have someone waiting who knows your name, and may God bless you and protect your family and keep you in the knowledge that the good that is done quietly is never truly lost, only waiting to be found.